Lagos, the city that never slept. The streets pulsed with life, cars honking, traders calling out their wares, and the scent of suya, roasted corn and fried plantain filling the air. It was a city where dreams were made and lost in the blink of an eye. But for Richard, Lagos was home and life was good. At 35, he was a successful architect with a bright future. His company Richard & Co. Designs was thriving. He had designed office buildings, luxury homes and even a few shopping malls. His bank account was healthy and he lived in a beautiful house in Victoria Island, one of the most prestigious areas of the city. By all measures he had achieved success. But his greatest treasure was not his career. It was his wife Aisha. Richard met Aisha on a rainy evening in a small bookstore on Lagos Island. He had ducked inside to escape the downpour, shaking water from his coat. As he browsed the shelves, his eyes landed on her. She was standing in the folklore section, flipping through an old book with a worn-out cover. She was breathtaking. Her deep brown skin had a glow to it, her dark eyes were large and hypnotic, and her full lips curved slightly in a soft, knowing smile. Her long black hair was pulled back into a simple braid, and she carried herself with quiet elegance. Richard, never one to be shy, walked up to her with a grin. "Folktales? I didn't think people still read those." She looked up, her smile widening slightly. "They are more than just stories," she said in a voice as smooth as silk. "They hold secrets of the world." Richard raised an eyebrow. "Secrets?" Aisha's fingers traced the pages of the book she held. "Yes. Every tale carries a hidden truth. If you listen carefully, you can learn the mysteries of life." Intrigued, Richard leaned against the shelf. "So, tell me, what mystery does that book hold?" She turned the book towards him. The title read, "The Spirits That Walk Among Us." Richard chuckled. "Ah, ghost stories." Aisha shook her head. "Not ghosts. Jinn, spirits and beings beyond human understanding. They live among us, hidden, watching." Richard laughed, amused. "And do you believe in all this?" Aisha's gaze met his, and for a moment he felt a strange chill run down his spine. "Do you?" she asked softly. That was the moment he knew she was different. Their conversation continued for hours. The rain outside turned into a soft drizzle, but they barely noticed. They talked about myths, legends, and the mysteries of life. She was different from any woman he had ever met, wise beyond her years yet full of curiosity. There was an air of mystery around her, something unexplainable, but instead of scaring him, it fascinated him. Richard was captivated. Their romance moved quickly. Within months they were inseparable. They spent late nights on the beach, watching the waves crash against the shore, speaking about dreams and destiny. She rarely spoke about her past, only saying that she had no family left. A year after they met, they got married. It was a simple but beautiful ceremony. Richard felt like the luckiest man alive. The first few years of their marriage were perfect. Aisha was the ideal wife, loving, gentle, and caring. She supported his dreams, encouraged his ambitions, and brought peace into his life. But as time passed, Richard began to notice things. Small things at first. Aisha never got sick. Not even a simple cold. At first he thought she was just lucky, but as the years went by, the thought became unsettling. He had seen friends and family members battle malaria, fever, and flu, but never Aisha. Even stranger, she never seemed to age. 3 years into their marriage, she looked exactly the same as the day they met. While Richard noticed a few strands of gray in his beard and the beginnings of laugh lines on his face, Aisha remained untouched by time. Her beauty was frozen, her skin smooth, her hair just as thick and dark as ever. Then there were her habits. She never ate food cooked by others. No matter how delicious a meal looked, if she had not made it herself, she would only smile and politely refuse. Even when they visited his mother's house, she would take only water or fruit, never touching the food prepared by Mama. She also never entered a mosque or a church. Whenever Richard went to pray, she would wait outside. When he asked why, she would simply say, "I feel more comfortable here." At first he brushed these things off. Some people had unusual habits. But then came the nighttime disappearances. Richard often woke up in the middle of the night to find her side of the bed empty. She always returned before dawn, slipping under the sheets as if nothing had happened. The first few times he thought she just had trouble sleeping. But one night he decided to follow her. He lay in bed pretending to be asleep. He listened carefully as she slipped out of bed, her movements graceful and soundless. But as soon as he tried to rise and follow, an overwhelming drowsiness overtook him. His eyelids became impossibly heavy, and before he knew it, he had fallen into a deep, dreamless sleep. It happened every time he tried. No matter how hard he fought it, he would always wake up hours later, confused and frustrated. When he asked her about it, she would only smile and say, "You worry too much, my love." But now Richard was starting to worry. One afternoon, Richard traveled to Abaddon to visit his mother. Mama was a small, sharp-eyed woman who had raised him and his siblings alone after their father passed. She was deeply religious and believed in the old ways, in spirits and unseen forces. As they sat on the front porch sipping palm wine, she suddenly gripped his hand. "My son," she said, her voice low and serious. "I have been watching your wife." Richard frowned. "Mama, please don't start." She ignored him. "Have you not noticed? She never eats food prepared by another woman. She never enters a mosque. And her eyes—" Mama's voice dropped to a whisper. "There is something strange about them. They shine too much." Richard chuckled nervously. "Mama, you're imagining things." Mama shook her head. "Not all things are as they seem, my son. You must be careful. Some spirits look like humans, but they are not. Some creatures can love like us, marry like us, but they do not belong to our world." Richard sighed, rubbing his temples. "Mama, Aisha is a good woman. She loves me. That's all that matters." Mama looked at him with deep worry. "Even if she is not what you think she is?" That night, as Richard lay in bed beside Aisha, his mother's words echoed in his mind. He turned to look at his wife's peaceful face. The soft glow of the moon cast shadows on her perfect features. For the first time in his life, fear crept into his heart. Richard tried to ignore his mother's words, but they clung to him like a shadow. He had always been a rational man, someone who believed in logic, science, and facts. Spirits, jinn, supernatural beings. Those were just stories told to scare children. But now, strange thoughts began creeping into his mind. He started watching Aisha more closely. The way her skin never seemed to lose its glow, even on days when she barely left the house. The way she would tilt her head and listen as if she could hear things no one else could. The way her deep brown eyes sometimes flashed silver in the moonlight just for a second, so quick he wondered if he had imagined it. The way she disappeared at night. The more he paid attention, the more uneasy he became. One evening he decided to test something. Richard waited until Aisha was in the kitchen, then walked into the bedroom, picked up his phone and called her number. The phone was on the bedside table. It didn't ring. His heart pounded. How was that possible? He double-checked the number, then called again. Nothing. It was as if her phone didn't exist. He hurried to the kitchen. Aisha was stirring a pot of stew, humming softly. "You left your phone in the bedroom," he said casually. She didn't look up. "I know. I tried calling you just now." This time she turned to face him, a spoon in her hand. "Oh, the network must be bad." Richard felt a chill. "The phone didn't even ring, Aisha." She smiled, walked over and kissed his cheek. "Don't worry so much, my love. The food is ready." She always had a way of making his worries fade, but this time it didn't work. That night he didn't sleep. He lay awake listening. Waiting. At exactly 2:43 a.m. Aisha stirred beside him. She moved so gently that the bed barely shifted. She sat up, turned her head slightly as if listening to something he couldn't hear, then silently slipped out of bed. Richard felt his heart hammering. Stay awake, he told himself. He heard the soft creak of the bedroom door. Stay awake. He took a deep breath, pushed the sheets back slowly and sat up. Then it hit him. A sudden crushing wave of sleep. His eyelids became impossibly heavy. His body felt like it was sinking into the mattress. He tried to fight it, but his limbs wouldn't move. His mind was screaming to stay awake, but his body betrayed him. Within seconds, darkness swallowed him whole. The next morning he woke up feeling drained. It was the same thing every time. The moment Aisha left, he was forced to sleep. It was unnatural. He decided to talk to someone. Later that day he met up with his best friend James at a small bar in town. James was a no-nonsense man, blunt and straightforward. They had been friends since university, and if there was anyone Richard could trust, it was him. After ordering drinks, Richard leaned in. "Bro, I need to tell you something." James took a sip of his beer. "Go ahead." Richard hesitated, then sighed. "It's about Aisha. She's been..." acting strange. James frowned. Strange how? Richard explained everything. The disappearances at night, the strange sleep that overcame him, the phone that wouldn't ring, the fact that she never aged or got sick. When he finished, James leaned back, exhaling sharply. Richard. What? James hesitated. Then, lowering his voice, he said, have you ever considered that she might not be human? Richard laughed, but it was hollow. Come on, James. Be serious. I am serious. James leaned forward, his expression grim. There are stories, my guy. Stories about Jinn marrying humans. They live among us, pretending to be normal. Some of them are good, some are dangerous. But one thing is certain, they are not like us. Richard shook his head. That's ridiculous. Is it? James asked. Explain why she never gets sick. Explain why you can't stay awake when she leaves at night. Explain why her phone won't ring. Richard fell silent. James lowered his voice. Listen, I know you love her. But you need to be sure. Test her. How? James's face was deadly serious. Jinn hate iron. It burns them. They also hate the recitation of holy words. Try it. If she reacts, you'll have your answer. Richard felt his chest tighten. He didn't want to believe it. He didn't want to think that the woman he loved was something else. But he had to know. That evening when Richard got home he was quiet. Aisha noticed. Is everything okay? He forced a smile. Yeah. Just tired. She nodded, brushing a hand against his face. You work too hard. He kissed her forehead, trying to ignore the tightness in his chest. Later that night, after she had gone to bed, Richard went into the kitchen. He picked up a small iron rod from his toolbox. It wasn't much, but it would do. With shaking hands he went back to the bedroom. Aisha was asleep, her chest rising and falling gently. Slowly, carefully, he reached out and touched her bare arm with the iron rod. What happened next made his blood run cold. Aisha's body jerked violently. A sharp hiss escaped her lips, like steam bursting from a pipe. Her skin sizzled where the iron touched it as if it were burning. And then, for the first time since they met, Aisha's eyes snapped open in terror. She knew what he had done. Richard dropped the iron, his hands shaking. His heart pounded so loudly it drowned out every other sound. Aisha sat up slowly, her eyes glowing in the dim light. For a long moment neither of them spoke. Then, in a voice that sent a shiver down his spine, she whispered, "Why did you do that, Richard?" Richard's breath caught in his throat. His hands trembled as he backed away from the bed, his eyes locked on Aisha's. She wasn't angry. She wasn't yelling. She was afraid. That was what terrified him the most. Aisha, his loving wife who always seemed in control, was now looking at him as if he had just uncovered something dangerous. She lowered her gaze to the iron rod that had rolled onto the floor. A deep silence filled the room. Then her voice came soft but firm. "Where did you learn this?" Richard swallowed hard. He wanted to deny it, to pretend he hadn't done anything, but what was the point? "I had to know," he said hoarsely. "I had to know the truth." Aisha exhaled, closing her eyes for a moment. When she opened them again, they glowed, a soft, unnatural silver light that flickered like a dying flame. Richard's stomach twisted. This wasn't normal. This wasn't human. She reached for him, but he flinched. For the first time since they met, he was afraid of his wife. Pain flashed across her face, but she withdrew her hand. "You weren't supposed to find out like this," she whispered. Richard's heart pounded. "Then how was I supposed to find out, Aisha? Were you ever going to tell me?" She didn't answer. Her silence was worse than any lie. A long pause stretched between them before Aisha finally spoke. "I wanted to tell you," she said. "But I was afraid. I was afraid that if you knew the truth you would leave me." Richard clenched his fists. "What truth, Aisha?" She inhaled deeply as if preparing herself for something painful. "I am not like you." Richard let out a bitter laugh. "I know that now." Aisha looked down at her hands. "I am a Jinn." Even though he had suspected it, hearing her say it out loud made his knees weak. Jinn. The word itself felt unreal. It was something from folk tales, from whispered stories told by elders in the village. Not something he had ever imagined could be real. Not something he had ever thought he would marry. Aisha continued, her voice steady but full of sorrow. "I was born in a world different from yours. A world beyond human sight. I lived there for many years, until I fell in love with a man from this world. Richard's breath hitched. Me? She nodded. You. His head spun. His entire marriage, his entire life with her, had been built on a lie. You should have told me, he muttered. I know. Aisha's voice broke. But I was afraid, Richard. I love you. I didn't want to lose you. Richard turned away, running a hand over his face. His mind was a mess of emotions: anger, fear, heartbreak. How long? He asked. How long have you been hiding this? Aisha hesitated. Since the beginning. Richard let out a hollow laugh. So our whole marriage has been a lie. No, Aisha said quickly. Richard, my love for you is real. Everything we've shared is real. The only thing I hid was what I am. Richard shook his head. It didn't matter. A lie was still a lie. Aisha stood up slowly, watching him carefully as if afraid he might run. There are things you don't understand, she said softly. There is a world that exists beside yours, hidden in the shadows. My kind Jinn live there. Richard crossed his arms, his body tense. And what do Jinn do, Aisha? Do they hurt people? Aisha's eyes darkened. Some do. But not all. Just like humans, there are good and bad among us. Richard scoffed. And which one are you? She flinched as if the words physically hurt her. I have never hurt you, she said quietly. And I never will. Richard wanted to believe her. He really did. But how could he? Everything he thought he knew about her had changed. You leave at night, he said. Where do you go? Aisha hesitated. Aisha, Richard's voice hardened. Tell me the truth. She sighed. To my world. Richard's stomach dropped. You mean, another place? Like another dimension? Yes, she said. There is a veil between our worlds. I cross it when I need to. Richard sat down heavily on the edge of the bed, rubbing his temples. This was too much. It didn't make sense. It shouldn't make sense. Aisha knelt before him, her hands gently resting on his knees. Richard, I know this is hard to accept. But I love you. I chose to be with you. I have never done anything to hurt you. Richard met her glowing eyes. And the iron? Why did it burn you? Aisha sighed. Jinn have weaknesses. Iron is one of them. Holy words too. Richard shuddered. He had always thought those were just myths. And what happens now? He asked. What am I supposed to do with this knowledge? Aisha bit her lip. That's what I'm afraid of. Richard frowned. What do you mean? Aisha hesitated, then whispered, They know you found out. Richard's blood turned to ice. They, he echoed. Aisha gripped his hands. Pie kind. A sickening realization settled in Richard's stomach. You mean, other Jinn? Aisha nodded. They will not be happy. A heavy silence filled the room. Then a soft knock on the door. Richard's breath hitched. It was late. Too late for visitors. Aisha's grip on his hands tightened painfully. Richard, she whispered urgently. No matter what happens, do not open that door. Richard's skin prickled. Who is it? Aisha's lips trembled. One of them. A second knock. This time louder. A cold dread settled over Richard. Someone or something was waiting outside. Aisha's voice was barely audible when she spoke again. They've come for you. The room felt like it had shrunk. Richard could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. The knock came again. This time it was louder. More demanding. Aisha's hands trembled as she gripped his. Richard, listen to me, she whispered. You must not open that door. Richard swallowed hard. His throat was dry. His mind was screaming at him to run, but his body felt frozen. Who is it? His voice was barely more than a breath. Aisha hesitated. Then in a voice full of fear she said, My brother. Richard's stomach dropped. You're what? She didn't answer. Instead she stood up and moved toward the door, standing between him and it like a shield. A third knock. This time the door shook in its frame. Richard, a deep voice called from the other side. Come out. Richard shivered. Whoever was out there wasn't human. He knew it. He could feel it. I don't want to talk to him, Richard whispered. Aisha turned to him, her eyes filled with urgency. I will protect you. But you must promise me one thing. Richard nodded, barely able to breathe. Aisha's silver eyes bore into his. No matter what you hear, no matter what you see, do not say a word. Richard's lips parted. What? Boom. The door rattled violently as if something massive had slammed into it. The air grew heavy, thick with an invisible force. The light bulb above them flickered. A strange humming sound filled the air, vibrating through Richard's bones. Then silence. Richard and Aisha didn't move. A single whisper seeped through the wood of the door. Come out, human. Or shall I come in? Aisha's body tensed. No, she murmured. Not yet. Richard's skin crawled. He had never felt anything like this before. It was as if the very walls around them were alive, listening, watching. Then without warning the entire room went dark. Richard couldn't see anything. Not even Aisha. A chill wrapped around him and a low, guttural growl echoed through the room. It was coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. A flash of silver, Aisha's eyes, cut through the darkness. Then a voice, deep, ancient and furious. You betrayed us, Aisha. Richard's blood ran cold. Then crash. The door exploded inward, sending wooden splinters flying across the room. Richard barely had time to react before he felt something huge move past him. The air turned bitterly cold. Then light. The darkness vanished as quickly as it had come. Standing in the wreckage of the doorway was a man, but he wasn't a man at all. His skin was too smooth, too perfect. His eyes glowed like molten gold. His shadow stretched unnaturally long across the floor. Richard knew immediately, this was not a human being. Aisha stepped forward, placing herself between them. You shouldn't have come here, she said. The being, her brother, tilted his head slightly, his golden eyes narrowing. And yet here I am. His gaze flickered to Richard. The moment their eyes met, Richard felt his entire body go cold. It was like a weight pressing on his chest, like something unseen was reaching inside him. Then just as suddenly the feeling disappeared. The Jinn smirked. He knows Aisha. And you let him live. Aisha's hands clenched into fists. He is my husband. The Jinn laughed, a dark hollow sound. Husband? You forget what you are. What we are. You think love changes that. Aisha's voice was firm. I love him. And I will not let you harm him. The Jinn's eyes darkened. You do not have the power to stop me. Richard stumbled back as the very air seemed to ripple, vibrating with invisible energy. Aisha's silver glow flared brighter. Then the Jinn moved. It was too fast. A blur of motion. Before Richard could react, the creature was standing right in front of him. A shadow stretched over Richard's body, swallowing him whole. Then the Jinn whispered something in a language Richard didn't understand. And suddenly Richard couldn't breathe. It was as if an invisible hand had wrapped around his throat. Richard gasped, clutching at his neck, but there was nothing there. His vision blurred. His lungs burned. He was going to die. Through the haze he barely heard Aisha scream, and oh, there was a flash of silver light, blinding, searing. The weight on Richard's throat lifted and he collapsed, coughing, struggling to fill his lungs with air. When he looked up, Aisha was glowing brighter than ever, her entire body pulsing with energy. Her brother stood motionless, watching her. Then in a low voice he said, You would defy your own kind, for him? Aisha's voice shook, but she didn't back down. I would. A terrible silence fell between them. Then the Jinn smiled. A slow, dangerous smile. So be it, he said. Richard barely had time to process what was happening before the Jinn raised his hand. And Aisha screamed. Richard's heart stopped. Aisha fell to her knees, her body shaking violently. Aisha! Richard lunged forward, but an invisible force threw him backward, slamming him into the wall. The Jinn's golden eyes gleamed. You want to live, human? His voice was mocking, cruel. Richard's breath came in short gasps. Leave her alone. The Jinn crouched beside Aisha, tilting his head. She made her choice. Aisha's body trembled. Her glow was fading. Richard's chest ached. He couldn't lose her. Please, he whispered. Don't take her from me. The Jinn studied him for a long moment. Then he smiled again. You love her, don't you? Richard's throat tightened. Yes. The Jinn stood, dusting off his hands. Then make a choice, human. His eyes gleamed with amusement. Her life, or your freedom. Richard's blood ran cold. What? The Jinn chuckled. You know too much. You've seen too much. You can't walk away from this world now. He stepped closer, his presence pressing down on Richard like a physical weight. So choose, Richard. His voice was soft but deadly. Will you leave her behind and live a normal life? Or will you stay with her, and never be free again? Richard's breath caught in his throat. He looked at Aisha, weak, struggling to hold on. Then he looked at the Jinn's golden, unblinking eyes. He had only one chance to decide. Richard's mind was spinning. The weight of the decision crushed him. Aisha was on her knees, struggling to breathe, her once glowing form dimming by the second. Her brother, the Jinn with golden, merciless eyes, watched Richard with amusement, as if he were nothing more than an insect caught in a web. Choose, human, the Jinn said again, his voice like a whisper in the wind. Her life or your freedom. Richard clenched his fists. His heart pounded so hard he thought it might burst. There was no real choice. He had spent years with Aisha, built a life with her, loved her in ways he didn't think were possible. How could he turn his back on her now? He swallowed hard, then lifted his head. I choose her, Richard said, his voice firm despite the fear clawing at his chest. The Jinn tilted his head, his expression unreadable. Are you certain? Richard nodded. I won't leave her. A slow smile spread across the Jinn's face. A dangerous, knowing smile. So be it. The moment the Jinn spoke, a powerful force surged through the room. The air crackled with unseen energy, and the walls shuddered as if something ancient had awoken. Richard gasped as a burning heat spread across his chest. He clutched his shirt, but the pain wasn't physical. It was inside him, in his very soul. Aisha cried out, reaching for him, but an invisible force held her back. Then just as suddenly as it came, the pain vanished. Richard blinked. The room was still again. Aisha collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath. Richard rushed to her, pulling her into his arms. She was alive. But something felt different. Richard turned back to the Jinn, who was watching him with quiet amusement. You are one of us now, the Jinn said. Richard stiffened. What do you mean? The Jinn's golden eyes gleamed. You chose her, which means you chose our world. You no longer belong fully to the human realm. Richard's stomach twisted. No. That's not possible. The Jinn chuckled. You will see soon enough. Then without another word he vanished. A sudden gust of wind, a flicker of golden light, and he was gone. 4 days Richard tried to convince himself that nothing had changed. But he was wrong. The first sign came the next night. He lay in bed, Aisha beside him, when a strange sensation crawled over his skin. It was like invisible fingers brushing against him, like something unseen was watching. Then he realized he could see the shadows move. They slithered across the walls, shifting in ways that made no sense. Whispers filled his ears, soft, eerie voices speaking in a language he didn't understand. He shot up, gasping. Aisha woke immediately. Richard, what's wrong? He stared at the walls. The shadows were gone. The whispers had stopped. But he knew what he had heard. Something was different now. And deep down he knew the truth. He would never be just a normal man again. As the days passed, Richard's connection to the unseen world grew stronger. He could hear things others couldn't. See things others couldn't. Once, in the market, he caught sight of a man whose shadow moved in the opposite direction of the sun. The man turned to him and smiled knowingly. Another time, while walking alone at night, he felt a presence behind him, only to turn and find nothing but empty air. He was changing. Becoming something else. Aisha saw it too. She watched him with worry, holding his hand tighter each day as if afraid he might slip away. One evening, as they sat on their balcony overlooking the city, Richard spoke the words that had been haunting him. I'm not the same, Aisha. She lowered her gaze. I know. Silence stretched between them. Then Aisha took his hand in hers. You don't have to go through this alone. Richard turned to her, searching her silver eyes. He saw love there. And sadness. She had known this would happen. She had tried to protect him. But now there was no going back. This was his fate. A fate bound to hers. And no matter what came next, Richard knew one thing for certain. He would face it with her. Together.